Lou, the year was 1980 something. I was scooping ice cream at Scoops Ahoy in the Starcourt Mall. My friend and I intercepted a Russian communication, and we found out that the Soviets had an entire operation underneath the mall. It was a whole thing. That didn't actually happen. That was part of season 3 of Stranger Things. But today, we're going to be talking about the death of malls.
Dun, dun, dun.
Welcome, everyone, to Fundamentals Unfiltered, the weekly podcast from the Fundamental Investing Institute. I'm Matt.
I'm Louie.
And today we're going to be talking about the death or really decline of malls, and by that, the kind of malls that we grew up with. This show is brought to you by Fundamental Investing Foundations. That's the beginner's course from the Fundamental Investing Institute. This is the most comprehensive beginner's course available. I have done a lot of research on this, and if you take this course, you're going to be well on your way to investing like the pros. Now let's get into this week's deep dive. We were hoping to do a little field trip to our local mall. We put that off, but in the place of that, I had you watch a documentary that I watched a couple of years ago called the Jasper Mall. Now, before we get into talking about that, I want to talk about a little bit of background research that I did, and I relied on a couple of books. One is called Meet Me by the Fountain, An Inside History of the Mall. It's by Alexandra Lang, I think is her last name. And then I also relied very heavily on more of a textbook. This is from the Urban Land Institute, textbook on retail development. And this actually kind of comes back to our story because the Urban Land Institute has been putting out these guides really since the 1940s. So the story of malls, the kind of malls that we grew up with, these big enclosed air-conditioned indoor malls with the anchor, that is very much a function of suburban development right after the Second World War. And what a lot of people forget is that after the Second World War, the United States was really the only intact industrial economy in the world. So there was this huge surge of optimism from the victory in Europe and in the Pacific. And there is, of course, the post-war prosperity. The GI Bill sends a lot of American soldiers to college and gets them started. And you had federal housing subsidies, but you start to have suburban development. And that comes in large part from the 1956 Interstate Highway Bill. And when you get these developments, you start to obviously have a real need for retail, but there's this idea that suburbia kind of needs a place to gather, like a place to congregate, almost like a downtown. And this is the idea of a number of architects to sort of design these big retail anchored centers that could be real pillars of the community. They could be places where communities could gather. And this is why you have the atriums and you have the fountains, and they were enclosed. So if you didn't have good weather, people could still go to them and they could stay warm in the event that it was cold outside, or they could, where we are in Florida, it is hot as heck. And you could go to one of these indoor malls and walk around and you could be cool. Now, beginning really, I think in the late 90s, early 2000s, these kind of malls in a lot of places just really start to go into decline. And my first thought was that the biggest driver was just online retail. The more I dug into it, and frankly, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that was wrong, because there was a tremendous amount of brick and mortar retail development. And one of the things that was really driving the decline of a lot of these malls were frankly other malls. So what would happen in a lot of these areas is you would just have a new mall being built, and shoppers would go to that new mall and anchors would go to that new mall. And so now Chris Rock made a joke about this, about having, the shiny new mall and the decrepit mall in a lot of these towns. But that was one driver. And then obviously online retailing was a big driver. And then when COVID hit, of course, people just stopped going out. both as a result of the mandates, the shutdowns, but also just the fear of going out in general. And for a lot of these malls, this was kind of the death knell. Now, you and I watched this Jasper Mall documentary, and this is about kind of that typical, 1980s enclosed mall, the kind of place that you and I would have gone to. What was your impression watching that documentary?
So yeah, so I watched it last night. I will start off by saying I need to rewatch it because I watched it with my wife and daughter, and they are not the best people to watch shows with. They could not be quiet, so I couldn't.
Were they at least engaging with the documentary, or were they just talking about things that had nothing to do with it at all?
No, they were engaging with it, but
Okay.
you would miss the next uh, thing because they would still be talking on what it brought up. So yeah, there were a lot of. I want to watch it again, just to let it sink in a lot more for me. You brought up. There's a couple points that really stood out to me. You brought up those anchor stores.
Yeah, they were gone in that
Yeah.
case because their two anchors, originally they said it was Kmart and it was J.C. Penney, and then later. So that's how a lot of these malls were developed, is they would
Hmm.
have an anchor on one side, an anchor on the other, and then you would have these corridors. And I'll get into, there's an interesting historical origin to the word mall
Yep.
that has to do with it. But you'd have these, long air conditioned corridors, and you have all these small shops on the side. Theirs originally were J.C. Penney and Kmart,
Hmm.
and they were gone. And then so that they were just. I mean, there's a scene in the documentary where he's going through this Kmart, and it is spooky. You could have a horror movie.
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was it was scary, but
Yeah.
they did, at least at the time. I don't know about the mall now, but they did have a Belk that came in later as like a third anchor, and that
Mm.
was still there.
Yeah.
But no, this was a shopping center that was hanging on by the thread. I felt really bad for the guy. It seems like running the thing by himself. I mean,
Yeah.
he's not just security. He's doing janitorial work. He's doing leasing. I was like, wow. Just shows you how stretched thin these things are.
Yeah. And you think about the mall was built in 1981,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Year
And
I was born.
for us, right, that was the time we were growing up, 80s, 90s. The mall was so big, not only in just our day-to-day lives, but even in Hollywood.
Yeah,
A lot of scenes were filmed in malls, were taken place in malls. They were an economical driver to our community. They
yeah,
gave
huge.
young kids opportunities to work. They gave businesses to strive. But another thing that stood out to me was the documentary was filmed in 18 and 19, but was released at the Sundance Festival in 2020, right before COVID really took place.
I think
So,
that's when I watched it, was during COVID,
mhm,
and I think I watched it during, more or less, during the shutdowns in the spring, early summer.
yeah,
So I think it probably had a huge emotional impact just because of, everyone staying home, and there was this huge surge of nostalgia,
yeah,
which was interesting, right?
yep,
Because during COVID, there was this huge surge of nostalgia where we all just kind of, when we need that, that comfort food, so to speak, we all think back to our childhoods, or we all think back. So yeah, it came out at an interesting time.
yeah, and it's curious, like if they would ever do a follow up to see what it's
Right.
like now after COVID,
Yeah.
after those things that happen. My daughter currently right now, she's 16. She actually has a job at a mall,
Wow.
which it's not a retail store though, so it's very different. We grew up where it was the hangout. It was the
Were you a loiterer, or did you just go hang out for hours on end at the mall? Because I didn't.
Mm, not really, but I had to have a purpose.
Right.
But I would meet groups of friends there, girlfriends, stuff
Right.
like that growing up. Um, if I needed shopping, I worked at the mall at a couple different retail
Really?
stores.
I
Yeah,
didn't know that.
when I was in high school. And but they've all changed. None of them are there anymore.
Yeah.
So and that's the biggest thing. Um, you know, you look at your food court. We all still kind of crave that that Chinese food from the food
Oh,
court
absolutely.
every once in a while, and what has stayed around. Um, I think the Sabaros, however you say it, is
Yeah.
probably one of the only ones that
Yeah, the
have
pizza
the
place.
pizza place that lasted. You know,
I
um,
don't know. It's going to be interesting when we go there and we walk around because I have been to our local mall a few times, but in the last few years, but I don't like walk the whole mall.
yeah.
There's a bookstore there. There's a Books a Million that was just renovated. I'll go in there sometimes, or I'll just go in through the food court through that exit. But as far as, walking that whole mall the way we did
Mhm.
back in the day, I haven't done that in 25, 30 years.
Well, we talk about retail being anchors. Um, you know, when our mall, the way it was set up, even food restaurants were anchors.
Right.
And those are no longer part of the mall atmosphere in our local mall. I do also something I think about our mall, and I've always thought about, and not even with just this topic. You brought up earlier the different structures of malls, right? Like the indoor enclosed mall, how much it costs to run. We live in South Florida. And I think people have the misunderstanding of Southwest Florida or South Florida, where most of the people come down here during the wintertime when we have great weather.
Right.
And the new malls are outdoors.
Which is interesting because those 6 months out of the year where it is hot and humid, it's pretty unbearable to walk around. Now, if you're going to one store, maybe going to a few stores, it's fine. But to walk around all of that in the middle of the summer, I mean,
Yeah.
don't wear nice clothes because you're going
Yeah.
to be, you're going to be soaked in sweat.
Yeah. And I know this is crazy. You get up north, places have a lot of parking garages, right?
Right.
That are attached to retail and attached to malls. We don't have that. Well, people don't realize our torrential rains we get
Oh,
during,
yeah.
so not only the heat, rain, and that, so I think the idea of the enclosed mall is still a great idea in certain locations, but you're right.
Well,
The
the thing is, the anchors, uh, the department stores are just not there. I mean, so in a lot of ways, the decline of malls, as we're talking about them now, is very much a decline of those traditional department store anchors.
Yeah.
J.C. Penney went bankrupt, and it's a shell of what it was in the past.
Yep.
I think there's now maybe 82, 83 Sears locations
Mm-hmm.
left as they came out of Chapter 11. Kmart no longer exists. A lot of those anchor stores that would have been there, those department stores, they just don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So you're going to see redevelopment, and that's the point. Is and if we're just talking about malls as a big real estate asset that is underperforming, there's plenty of private equity money that is going to go in, and or possibly by themselves or through municipal partnerships, but they will buy these assets and they will get someone in there.
Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things about this book that I've read is the author is she's an architectural critic, and so she is talking a lot about the architecture and is talking a lot about how a lot of the formerly enclosed malls, and of course there are some malls that were kind of built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s that are thriving. They've been renovated as needed. But one of the things that's happening with a lot of the really old malls is you have like fitness centers that are going into those old anchor spaces. In some cases, you have community colleges that are coming in, public libraries, big call centers are coming in.
Mm-hmm.
So this significant amount of space, I mean, it is being leased, and I kind of wonder why these underperforming assets are still there for years on end.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't somebody intervening? Maybe the current owners are just making enough money to be happy with,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's interesting to see these things that are in need of redevelopment, because as we know, at the right price, everything can be feasible.
Yeah.
And that's kind of interesting. But it's to see that change, to see, like I said, libraries, college, mega churches are coming in to those spaces in some cases. So they are finding alternative uses. Now let's get back to Jasper Mall. I don't know a lot about Jasper. I think it's Alabama.
Yeah.
Is it? I don't know a lot about their local economy, but one thought that came to me is, what's going on in their broader economy. Like, is this just a reflection of a town that's in decline, maybe because they've not lost a major employer or something like that? Those are kind of the questions that I would ask too. So as much as it is a commentary on the decline of malls, it might be a commentary on the decline of just a small, southern town.
So, so that I'm glad you brought that up, because that kind of makes me also think about who's running the malls.
Mm-hmm.
Do they know we have to kind of understand our market,
Right.
right? Are they following the market trends? Are they following who needs to be there, who doesn't need to be there? Are they out of touch because they're not in touch with the youth of the world that is craving these places? And again, I agree. We live in a unique, we live in a touristy, although it's throughout our lifetime has changed.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'll get to that in a minute.
But to see, we have thriving malls, we have malls that are not thriving. What's making it? You brought up the point of things being, that was one thing that I thought about in the movie. Look at all this old technology that is in that mall, that
Yeah.
Jasper Mall. The old, the old electric meters that run the power supply for each location. How the guy has to turn it on. Is that something that could be automated, could save people money, where could lower the cost of things to bring some anchor stores back in? Like, do they not think of the infrastructure that they could do and spend to bring it up to what they might need?
I think it becomes a catch-22, right? Because to make these investments, you need to see the revenue, and the revenue's not there to make the investments.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So somebody has to take that entrepreneurial risk
Yeah.
to go in there and make those improvements.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I found very sad is there was a jeweler in there who
Yep.
ended up having to leave, and he was talking, and it made me very sad because he was a small independent business. We think about malls in terms of Foot Locker and like these big corporate stores, but he was just a proprietor running a small jewelry shop, and he flat out said there is just not enough traffic in here for me to live, and pay my bills. We have to go to a different location, and that's exactly what happened. He moved. The woman that retired, one thing that was not said, she was a florist, and she ended up retiring and closing the store. One thing that she did not mention is, could that business have been sold?
Yeah.
Right. And there's a whole nother possible sub story there about why was this lady not able to, sell her business? Because in that case, she actually mentioned that a lot of her business came over the phone. It wasn't
Hmm.
necessarily driven by foot traffic, but it might have just been the perception of her being in the mall that, you know, she wasn't able to sell her business and ended up just having to close down.
Yeah.
So it it was interesting. I think this is a phenomenon that is happening across the United States, and I do kind of wonder um, just how long it's going to take for private developers, private equity firms, municipalities to come in and add some kind of feasibility to that. And of course, if there's not feasibility, they're going to be torn down altogether. And now a quick break from our sponsor, the Fundamental Investing Institute. Do you want to become a better investor but aren't sure where to start? With our Foundations of Fundamental Investing course, you will learn the principles behind long-term investing without stock tips, hypes, or trying to predict the market. Learn how to think about stocks as businesses, understand financial statements, evaluate companies, think about valuation, and build a disciplined investing process. Build your investing knowledge from the ground up. Explore fundamental investing foundations from the Fundamental Investing Institute. Start today at fundamentalinvestinginstitute.com/courses. Now, Louie, you were reminding me before the show that one of our local malls, not the big enclosed mall that we're talking about here, but one of the local malls was actually taken over by the school district, and I think it's kind of an example of how these things can be repurposed as well.
Yeah, so a little history about it. It was one of our malls. I want to say, don't quote me, but I think it was like in the 70s. It was our major mall.
Oh wow!
And
You know more about the local history than I do. So.
yeah, well, I'm a little older than you,
Yeah,
so
a little bit.
and it struggled. It tried to keep going. They tried to turn it into an indoor flea market. It didn't work.
And it was
And
probably disrupted by the new mall, which
exactly.
the new mall became the old mall.
Yes. Yeah.
It's kind
Yeah.
of the cycle.
Evolution, right?
Yeah,
If we will.
that's it.
So, what kind of ended up happening was it got put up, and I think it got taken over for a really reduced price.
Right.
Our local school district has actually won rewards for their architectural development of taking this old property and turning it into a functional school district main
Wow. So
hub.
this is where all the district employment is in this.
All the
Okay.
different heads of the
Right.
departments, the where they have the school board meetings, things like that.
Oh wow.
We
Interesting.
we have again, I like to say we're a small town, but
Not
we
so small anymore.
no,
But
and I think we're like in the top 100 largest school districts in the country,
wow.
which is kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah.
You know, so we do have a very very large school district. And again, if you look at the outside of the building, it just screams mall.
Yeah. So
And
you could still see it
yeah,
as
you could see
yeah.
those ghostly effects of those,
The haunted Kmart.
yeah. So,
Before we wrap up this segment, I just want to give you a little trivia because I didn't know this. The origin of the word mall, score one for the Paisans. There
yeah.
was a game, an Italian game in the 16th century called Palamaglio. I don't know if I'm probably not pronouncing that right. My grandfather's going to come back and haunt me. But Palamaglio, it was almost like a croquette-like game, and it eventually made its way over to Britain, and Britain actually they anglicized this, and they actually have a street. My understanding is they have a street named Paul Mall. But the word mall it was the anglicized version of just this long corridor where
Okay.
they would play this game.
Okay.
And I guess as the game became popular, the corridors would become like very well landscaped promenades and stuff. So if we think about like the National Mall in Washington, D.C., there's no shopping there.
Yeah.
It's just walking from one end
Yeah.
to the other. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. So if you ever want to, win a game of Jeopardy, You know that. Now, what we're going to talk about in some subsequent episodes of this, we're going to kind of stay on this mall topic, but we're going to go into some of the individual companies. And I think
Okay.
next week we're going to talk about kind of the department stores. So we'll talk
Mm-hmm.
about Sears, J.C. Penney's, and a few others. And then we're going to talk about things like KB Toys.
Okay.
And there's one that sticks out for me, and that's Barney's Tea and Coffee,
Mm-hmm.
which I didn't know that was actually a Florida-based business. It's still
Okay.
there. They just manufacture. They just don't have the physical locations anymore.
Well,
But yeah, so we're going to talk about some of these individual stores, and
I like that because we can talk about what stores have stayed.
that's exactly right. And
You know.
that's the question. I look at Barney's Tea and Coffee, and why were they not ahead of Starbucks,
Yeah.
right? Because I mean, they had these physical locations before Starbucks did, but um, I don't know. We're going to answer that question. I'm going to do some research, and we're going to ask.
Exciting.
Yeah, we're going to ask. What they could have done differently, and it'll be a lot of fun. If you're as excited as we are into doing this deep dive into malls and mall economics, hit subscribe, and you will be informed of new episodes as they come out.
And thank you for subscribing and watching, and we'll see you next time.